A Song of Ice and Fire author George R. R. Martin enjoys employing a wide variety of narrative trickery to hide the subtext of his storytelling, within something that seems simple, obvious, or not even worth acknowledging. And one of the best and most interesting instances of this comes in the form of Daenerys Targaryen's actions against the slavers of Meereen. Dany's conquest throughout Slaver's Bay is one of the most narratively rich and complex storylines within the entire series, and her liberation of these slave cities seems to be pretty straightforward on its face. However, there are some really interesting depths to these moments in the story that actually seem to reveal a lot about Daenerys as a leader that she doesn't even necessarily recognize about herself. And that is especially true about Dany's decision to crucify 163 slave masters in Meereen. Dany's choices here aren't particularly confusing, nor are they difficult to understand, and it's clear why George R. R. Martin set them up in this way. Daenerys' quest to free the slaves of Essos is undeniably a noble goal, and Dany's treatment of many of the slave masters that she encounters isn't particularly surprising. And her decision to crucify the masters as a punishment for the mutilated children that greeted her on her way to Meereen is especially easy to relate to and comprehend. This specific narrative trickery that George R. R. Martin uses is honestly one of his best, because the entire setup for this situation invites the reader to take absolutely everything at face value and question almost nothing about what Dany decides to do. Even though Dany herself seems to hint at some misgivings for her decision to crucify the masters, this eye for an eye punishment is completely comprehensible and easy to empathize with. And it positions Daenerys as a righteous arm of somewhat brutal justice towards nameless, faceless characters that are basically indefensible. On the surface, there is almost nothing complex or even worth questioning about this scenario, but that's what makes the subtext of this entire event even more interesting and informative. Again, the setup here is so overtly good versus evil that it essentially discourages the audience from questioning it whatsoever. Killing people who have enslaved, abused, mutilated, and murdered countless people for their own profit is not something anyone will ever be inclined to argue against, especially when they were possibly involved in or complicit with the horrific, brutal murders of children. But once you actually do start digging into the details, some really troubling aspects of the entire scenario emerge and very deftly demonstrate why Daenerys Targaryen is actually a pretty unjust leader and ruler. It's fascinating that the entire event is framed as a very one-for-one form of justice against the slave masters for their cruelty towards the children. It is literally 163 slave masters crucified for the 163 children that Daenerys counted and witnessed along the roads towards Meereen. But, while it seems to be some sort of an equal exchange, these actions and punishments are anything but true justice. A Storm of Swords, Daenerys 6, includes this incredibly informative passage. In the plaza before the Great Pyramid, the Meereenese huddled forlorn. The great masters had looked anything but great in the morning light. Stripped of their jewels and their fringed tokars, they were contemptible. A herd of old men with shriveled balls and spotted skin, and young men with ridiculous hair. Their women were either soft and fleshy or as dry as old sticks, their face paint streaked by tears. "I want your leaders," Dany told them. "Give them up, and the rest of you shall be spared." "How many?" one old woman had asked, sobbing. "How many must you have to spare us?" 163, she answered. She had them nailed to wooden posts around the plaza, each man pointing at the next. While Dany's decision-making is incredibly simple and easy to understand, there are a lot of fascinating and terrifying things happening here that say a lot about how Dany views justice and how dangerous her perspective on fair rule really is. The first and most obvious issue is ironically not Dany's punishment, but her supposed mercy. Dany takes 163 leaders and doles out the punishment towards them, and spares the rest. However, we and she have no idea who is actually responsible for the heinous acts committed against the children. And it is a near guarantee that there weren't exactly 163 masters who were personally responsible for the 163 crucified children. So what that essentially means is that regardless of whether or not Daenerys over or undershot the number of people who were culpable in these acts, the alleged justice that was served in some form of retribution for the children was anything but just. If there were more masters who colluded to crucify those children, then that means that people who committed the exact same crime were either punished by a horrifically painful and gruesome death, or weren't punished at all. Or, if fewer masters were involved in the decision to crucify the children, then that means that some of them were punished with the same form of torment that they were willing to visit onto child slaves, while others were brutalized as punishment for crimes that they didn't even commit. But of course, understandably, many don't care about this distinction, and it's not hard to see why. Ultimately, regardless of who did what, these are all masters who engaged in human trafficking and all sorts of unimaginable violations of basic human rights. So death by crucifixion is still a worthy punishment regardless of whether or not they are specifically culpable in this instance. And while that's actually a morally justified position to take, it still ignores the fundamental issue with Daenerys as a leader that these events expose. Firstly and most obviously, any ruler who punishes a crime in a way that runs the gamut from no consequences whatsoever to one of the worst death sentences imaginable is obviously not being fair or just in their execution of the law. But secondly, Dany doesn't actually even investigate as to who has done what. She essentially sentences well over 100 people to death based on the decisions of other people. Of course, she asks the Meereenese to offer up 163 leaders, but she doesn't investigate or even seemingly verify that these people were involved in the decisions to crucify the children, nor does she verify that these are leaders among the Meereenese slaver class. And the issues with this particular decision by committee method of judging who is guilty and who is innocent seems obvious. By offering up such an arbitrary number and making such an arbitrary request about a situation in society that she knows nothing about, she has given many people in the upper echelon of Meereenese society the opportunity to essentially eliminate their rivals or competition in the name of Dany's so-called justice. Ironically, despite the fact that this was meant to be a harsh punishment to the slavers, and an object lesson in what people get when they make Daenerys mad, it actually provided a lot of the more politically intelligent and manipulative masters of Meereen with an opportunity to strengthen themselves and get rid of potential rivals. Although the political relations of Meereen are an unknown to Dany and thus to the readers as well, it's obvious that if you applied a similar kind of situation to the upper classes of Westeros, the lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms almost certainly would not simply put forward the most powerful of their society as the sacrificial lambs for Dany's impromptu mass capital punishment. They would put forward their enemies and protect their allies. Or they would simply throw out the weakest of the bunch because there would be little consequences for betraying the people who aren't truly powerful in their societal structure. So with that in mind, it is a near certainty that some, if not most of the people who Dany killed were not only not responsible for what she was killing them for, but wound up on the literal cross because they were not powerful enough for their compatriots to bother protecting them, or because someone with more sway or political acumen wanted them gone. Again, based on the fact that they have committed inhuman crimes, their deaths aren't exactly unfortunate. But purging an arbitrary amount of this social class and allowing the other criminals to decide who lives and who dies has some very obvious potential downsides. The consequences of this were also likely immediate as well as far-reaching, although Dany herself probably didn't recognize it. She largely seems to see Meereen as a trial run to figure out how she is going to rule Westeros, and she frankly doesn't do a very skilled job of ruling the Meereenese. However, it is possible, if not probable, that her initial actions towards the Meereenese slavers that she crucified had a strong influence on how the political situation she was dealing with actually unfolded. Ironically, by immediately killing a significant number of people who were in the ruling class of Meereen, she radically changed the political landscape of the city, and likely not in a way that was beneficial to her or Meereen as a whole. Clearly, no one in a position of power in Meereen could be considered a good person by today's standards, but given how resistant Meereen is to Dany's rule, it seems like a pretty safe bet that the masters who were offered forward as sacrifices would have included anyone who might have made her conquest easier. If there were anyone among them who supported Daenerys or had some kind of ethical agreement with her desire to revolutionize the slave cities, they ironically were almost certainly among those that the Meereenese offered up to be killed. Daenerys ultimately encounters a great deal of problems when attempting to rule Meereen. While her inexperience as a ruler undoubtedly has a strong influence on her failings as their queen, it's interesting that she never makes the potential connection with her decision to mass execute a great deal of the ruling class of Meereen, and her extreme difficulties in keeping control of the city. But what's even more frightening are the long-term implications of this decision. Again, it's obvious that the majority of people in Meereen with power have no interest in Daenerys ruling them. But more importantly, Dany doesn't actually plan on ruling them in the long term, and they likely figured that out before she even arrived. She came and went in Astapor and Yunkai, and she has never been shy about seeing Westeros as her ultimate goal. So the politically astute leaders of Meereen undoubtedly saw a way to play this scenario to their own advantage. And while none of the people in the ruling class of Meereen could be considered morally good, it also seems pretty reasonable to assume that anyone who could exploit a mass execution as an opportunity is probably the last person anyone would actually want in power. Dany's conquest and abandonment of Astapor and Yunkai had disastrous consequences and presented an opportunity for incredibly brutal rulers to take over. And the crucifixion of the masters in Meereen probably eliminated the competition for a lot of other masters who will be ready to grab power once Daenerys leaves. So, while Dany's execution of the slave masters of Meereen isn't exactly morally objectionable, the issues that it presents for Meereen as a whole, as well as the problems that it exposes with Daenerys' ability to rule fairly and justly, are obvious. Except to Daenerys. Yes, she does express some misgivings about her decision to crucify them, but her understanding of the political implications or the injustice in her administration of the law are not a factor in her second-guessing whatsoever. Interestingly, it is mostly an emotional reaction that drives her to kill them. And it is mostly an emotional reaction that makes her regret killing them as well. Dany's emotional inner life is what makes her an appealing and relatable character, but it is also what exposes her as a very poor ruler. The fact that she allows her emotions to drastically influence her enforcement of the law is terrifying, and leads her to take unjust actions. But what makes it more telling about her future failures as a leader is that she does not understand or acknowledge that this is even a problem. Her perception of justice is so rudimentary that she thinks a literal exchange of a life for a life is fair and just, regardless of genuine culpability. Who is responsible for what is irrelevant, and it is one of the many examples where no semblance of an investigation or trial is even considered. But beyond that, it demonstrates that Daenerys is so politically inept that she doesn't even recognize that this is a political issue, and that she is likely giving her enemies and rivals a significant advantage by simply allowing the majority to decide who deserves to die as retribution for the actions of parties that are ultimately unknown to her. And the fact that she learned nothing from this and doesn't even recognize how this could be a misstep doesn't bode well for her future. Clearly, she has quite an axe to grind with the ruling class of Westeros because they deposed her father. And despite the incredible complexities of the political situation in the Seven Kingdoms, her understanding of those nuances are so completely non-existent that she sees political factions like the Starks and the Lannisters as one and the same. So, considering the fact that she made massive political decisions as soon as she arrived in Meereen, without even realizing that there were political implications to those choices, it shouldn't come as a surprise if she repeats the same mistake and gives some of the more dangerous and politically astute characters in Westeros an easy in to advance themselves and destroy their enemies. And it also shouldn't be a shock if Dany winds up aligning herself with some morally dubious people who are ultimately planning to betray her because she simply doesn't recognize the necessity in learning about how Westeros works before invading and radically changing it. The crucifixion of the Masters in Meereen does not seem complex on its face, but that is largely because Daenerys herself does not recognize the complexities of what she's doing or the potential ramifications of these choices. It is an incredibly well-crafted bit of narrative trickery that ironically exposes Dany as a very ill-equipped leader despite the fact that her actions don't seem to be morally objectionable. And these choices offer a great amount of insight as to why Dany's quest to rule is ultimately doomed to fail. But what do you think? Did Daenerys actually do something unjust or unintelligent by crucifying the 163 slave masters? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.